Welcome back to the Signs of the Times. Question, why did America invade Iraq? And we're going to pick up on that as we go forward. But right now, we have two choices, my friends. We can either follow Satan or we can follow Christ. And I'm sure some of you out there are thinking, well, why do I need to make a choice? Well, it's because, let me try and explain. Those of you who are computer literate, you will understand what the default setting is. Computers give you choices. You can actually choose this or that option, but if you don't choose one, then there is a default setting which the computer chooses for you. So if you do not choose Christ, the default setting is Satan. That's how it works. I'm sorry, but if you choose not to follow Christ, then you automatically choose the default setting, and that is Satan. Now, I would like to offer you a book. My name is Bruce Telfer, and I studied politics and history at university for 5 years, and I never really understood it until I read this book, The Great Controversy. Because you see, when you go into some study of history and politics and any sort of study really, they tell you how things work, they tell you why things work, they tell you when things work, but they often leave out the why. Why did things happen the way they did? And this is what this book explains. You don't need a university degree to understand it. It's a brilliant book. It gives you the background of the war in heaven, and it gives you the war on earth, which happened after that, and it gives you the final outcome, all based on Scripture. And I would thoroughly recommend it to anybody who wants to study these things and understand them. I have to tell you that this book was the beginning of my understanding of what's going on in the world. So if you've got a pen and paper, write down New Start New Zealand and the address, and there's the email address. And if you're not ready yet with a pen and paper, I'll put it up at the end of this presentation. So let's get back to our agendas. We've done Agenda 1, and we're still actually working on this agenda. This is a long one, the Bretton Woods and the petrodollar. And this has a major connection with why did America invade Iraq after 9/11. I would like you to meet the neoconservatives, or neocons, as they are known for short. Now, many of you will recognize these people. Some of you will recognize Rumsfeld here. This is Dick Cheney, the vice president under Bush. And this is the guru of the neocons. He's the ones who is the philosophical, that's Paul Wolfowitz. And he's the one who has the philosophical sort of bent that gives them the reasons for the things they do. And this one, I'm sure you know, Hillary Clinton and Bush Sr. and Condoleezza Rice and Bush Jr. and the present incumbent of the White House. These are all known as neocons, and they are people who are pushing this empire agenda and wanting America to be the supreme power in the world, and don't want any other supreme powers to compete with them. Now, the Wolfowitz doctrine includes, we read the first part up here, I just want to read the part in yellow here, that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. Now, which region in the world do you think would be the region that would create a global power if they had control over it? That's obviously the Middle East and all its oil and gas. That's what he's talking about. So that's why the Middle East is such a crucial region in this world at the moment, and provides many of our signs of the times. Do you remember Zbigniew Brzezinski? And he wrote this book, The Grand Chessboard, and he said that in order to control Eurasia, we need to control that ellipse there with all the strategic resources in it. Well, these guys, these neocons, they basically took Brzezinski's ideas and they expanded on them. And they came up with a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces and Resources for a New Century, a report on the project for the new American century. And they're talking about the century that we are now living in. And one of the most crucial and interesting statements they make in this document is, let me show you, it starts here. The process of transformation, in other words, the transformation of America into the only superpower, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophe and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So they're looking for a new Pearl Harbor. And if you want to actually read the statement in the actual document, here it is. I'll read it again. Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So, what they're looking for is something like this. When America was shocked into World War II. Now, prior to this, the American people were anti-war. They did not want to have anything to do with the European powers. They wanted to stay out of World War II. But this is what enabled America to enter into the war. They were forced into it. Okay, so here we have the new Pearl Harbor. And this attack on the Twin Towers and elsewhere in America, the Pentagon, etc. This shocked America into the war on terror. So that's why we have a war on terror, because America is trying to counteract the forces of evil in the world. So, why did America blame Saddam Hussein and Iraq for 9/11? Because the interesting thing is that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Nothing at all. But they used this new Pearl Harbor as the catalyzing event that they needed to propel America out into the world and really use the strength of the empire to impose its will upon the empire. Do you remember what Bush said? He said, if you're not with us, you are with the terrorists. So Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and even George Bush admitted to it, because he actually, in a press conference, states that Iraq had nothing to do with it. Let's listen to the words out of the horse's mouth.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing. What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
So, you see, even George Bush understood that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but nevertheless, the US government keeps pushing this idea that Iraq did have something to do with it, and they've pushed it very strongly. And people who have analyzed the press statements and the publications at the time, this is what they report on what they found. We suggest that the principal reason that 3/4 of the American public supported the war was that the Bush administration successfully convinced them that a link existed between Saddam Hussein and terrorism generally, and between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda specifically. Framing the war on Iraq in this way connected it intimately with 9/11. So how did they do that? Well, first they said, this is what Bush said, Al-Qaeda and Saddam are working together. He said that. It's reported by the New York Times. And Rumsfeld, he comes in and he says, yes, we have bulletproof evidence of links between Al-Qaeda and the government of President Hassan. And the New York Times says Iraq and Al-Qaeda are not obvious allies. In fact, they are natural enemies. So, whoops. Something's gone wrong here. The administration is actually saying, yes, they are working together. The New York Times comes out and says, no, they're not. They're actually natural enemies. And guess who's right? The New York Times is. They are natural enemies. Saddam Hussein's regime is a secular Arab regime. It has nothing to do with religion. He does not support religion. He certainly does not support terrorists. In fact, he used to attack his own people whenever they tried to take power out of his hands. He was a brutal dictator. There's no question about it. He did use gas on his own people, but he certainly was not a supporter of Al-Qaeda. And so the New York Times is correct. The US administration is wrong. So then they have to come up with another explanation. They're desperately trying to find a link between 9/11 and Iraq, because they want to go into Iraq again, but they can't go in without a good reason, all right? So they have to find one. So now Wolfowitz, he comes up with an idea, and this is what he says. The truth is that for reasons that have a lot to do with the US government bureaucracy, we settled on the one issue that everyone could agree on, which was weapons of mass destruction as the core reason. So now they've gone from Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein has links with Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. And that's why we have to go in there and take them away from him, because he may give them to Al-Qaeda or he may give them to terrorists. Just maybe he will. So we have to go in there. Notice what Wolfowitz says here, though. He says the one issue that we could all agree upon. In other words, they were confused. They were fighting. The administration was fighting amongst themselves to come up with a legitimate reason for why they wanted to go into Iraq. The real reason is kept well in the background. So, what is the real reason? Well, let's first look at what Colin Powell said before 9/11. He said that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction. And this was reported in 2003 by CBS News. He said, Saddam Hussein has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors. And the reason he's unable to do that is because he has been in trouble with the administration, and he has had sanctions imposed upon him. So he's not even capable of supplying medical supplies to his own population, and that's why they're dying. So, no, even back then, before 9/11, they admitted that he doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. But look what Colin Powell says after 9/11. The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world. Let me now turn to those deadly weapons programs and describe why they are real and present dangers to the region and to the world. Well, not just to the region, but to the whole world. Saddam Hussein does not have the ability to project anything in the way of aggression to his neighbors. But now he's a threat to the region and to the whole world with his weapons of mass destruction. See, the whole thing changed after 9/11. They're desperately trying to find a reason for attacking Iraq, so they make up stories. Look, the American media, which is generally very supportive of any American administration, even they start questioning it. Untruth and consequences. How flawed was the case for going to war against Saddam? Well, it was very, very flawed. This is something which came out in the Daily Telegraph. It's an English newspaper. The Iraq War, the greatest intelligence failure in living memory. That's what they blame it on now. They blame it on intelligence failure. Everybody knows now that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So what went wrong? Well, it's the intelligence community's fault. They gave us the wrong information. They told us there was weapons of mass destruction. So it's not our fault, it's the intelligence community. Much of the key intelligence that was used to justify the war was based on fabrication, wishful thinking, and lies. Well, that's better. You know, generally they call that spin, but now we're calling it lies. That's good. And as subsequent investigations showed, it was dramatically wrong. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. So this is very strange indeed. And even ex-people who worked with with Bush and his administration, they are coming out in these days, latter days, when all this has sort of gone by, when people don't pay attention. But nevertheless, some of them are coming out and telling the truth. Ex-CIA boss attacks Bush over WMD. That's George Tenet. George Tenet was director of the CIA at the time, and he basically was given the blame. Somebody had to be blamed, so it was an intelligence failure. And who's the head of the intelligence? Well, George Tenet. But then he fires back and says, no, it wasn't me. Ex-spokesman says Bush lied, and that's his press spokesman. Look, let me just read this first paragraph here. It says, George W. Bush's former press secretary stunned the White House yesterday with a scathing memoir that accused the president of deception in the run-up to the Iraq war. Wow, deception. And it was. There's no question about it. Because they could never tell what the real reason was. Now, here's another one. The Downing Street Memorandum, written July 23rd, 2002. This is just before they went into Iraq. And it was a very classified document, secret and strictly KI only. Why do we know about it? Well, it was published on May the 1st, 2005 by the London Times. And there is a book written about it called The Secret Way to War. And you can see that this memo has cut the head off George Bush. Well, here we go. What is in this document? Well, it's reporting on the head of the M16 military intelligence, Dr. Sir Richard Dearlove. He was in Washington to consult with his counterparts over there, and he comes back, and this is what he reports. He says, military action was now seen as inevitable. Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And then he makes this very revealing statement. He says, but the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. That's a sort of a polite way of saying we're gonna make stuff up. We're going to tell lies, and we're going to spin. We're going to take what intelligence is available, and we're going to change it and alter it so it suits what we want to do. And do you think the intelligence community was happy about that? No, they rebelled. I'll explain that in a minute. Well, this man, Philip Zelikow, he comes up and he says, well, the real reason is an unstated threat. Zelikow made his statements about the unstated threat during his tenure on a highly knowledgeable and well-connected body known as the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So he was a member of that board, and he said, oh, the real reason is an unstated threat, and we can't tell you what it is. And this is the threat that dare not speak its name, because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat, I will tell you frankly, and the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically because it is not a popular sell. So there you go. There's an unspoken threat that dare not speak its name. Nobody wants to tell you what it is, and the reason is because they cannot galvanize the American people to go to war if they told them what the real threat was. That's why it is unspoken, and we're not allowed to know. And I would like to remind you that this statement from a British historian, which says no matter what political reasons are given for war, the underlying reason is always economic. And so what is this economic reason? Well, this man, Alan Greenspan, who used to be the head of the Federal Reserve, he lets a little bit out. He says, I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge that everyone knows the Iraq war is largely about oil. Yes, but he doesn't tell us what the unspoken threat is. By the way, he wrote that in his autobiography. Henry Kissinger once again agrees. He says oil is much too important a commodity to be left in the hands of the Arabs, but he doesn't tell us either what the real reason was. Now here comes the real reason. This is why they had to go to war against Saddam Hussein and Iraq for a second time. It was because Saddam started to sell Iraqi oil for euros. He was the first to buck the trend against the petrodollar, and this was a huge threat to the empire because, You see, if Saddam Hussein was able to get away with it, then other countries would too. That's why they had to stop him. And that's why they had to go into Iraq and take away. You see, even though there were sanctions on Iraq, the United Nations allowed Saddam to sell a certain amount of oil so that he could eventually buy the vital things that he needs to keep his country basically running. And he decided that he was going to sell that oil for euros. And he did. And he actually made a fortune out of doing it because the euro went up in value against the dollar. So, the dollar is the empire's Achilles heel. One of the dirty little secrets of today's international order is that the rest of the globe could topple the United States from its hegemonic status whenever they so choose, with a concerted abandonment of the dollar standard. This is America's preeminent, inescapable Achilles heel for now and the foreseeable future. And many countries are catching on to this. The Federal Reserve's greatest nightmare is that OPEC will switch its international transactions from a dollar standard to a euro standard. Iraq actually made this switch in November 2000 when the euro was worth about 82 cents. It has actually made off like a bandit considering the dollar's steady depreciation against the euro. So here we have the same problem again. The dollar is under threat. And this is why I said to you before that America was the dollar, and the American dollar used to be supported and backed by gold, but now it's backed by oil. And any attack against this system is considered an attack against the national interests, not of America, but of the American empire. So that's why they had to go into Iraq and remove Saddam. So America invaded Iraq for imperial reasons to protect the US dollar. If anything put the final nail in Saddam Hussein's coffin, it was his move to start selling oil for euros. To avoid economical collapse, the Bush administration hastened to invade and to destroy Iraq under false excuses to make it an example to any country who may contemplate dropping the dollar, and to manipulate OPEC's decisions by controlling the second largest oil resource. Iraq oil sale was reverted back to the petrodollar standard. So all the talk about freeing the Iraqi people and promoting democracy was simple spin, Western propaganda. Now, I'm sure you all know who this man is. This man is Muammar Gaddafi, the president of Libya. And he was the president for something like 42 years, but then he had a sudden demise. 42 years, you know, during those 42 years, the Western powers never liked him. They did quite a few things against him. They tried to subvert his administration. But, you know, he was quite actually popular in his own country because he did a lot for his own people. You know, people even got things like electricity for free and all sorts of bonuses and benefits under his regime. But again, he made the fatal mistake of instituting the Gaddafi plan, where he was going to set up a system which would be able for African countries to trade together and sell oil for gold. The idea, according to Gaddafi, was that African and Muslim nations would join together to create this new currency, which was called the gold dinar, and would use it to purchase oil and other resources in exclusion of the dollar and other currencies. RT, which is Russian television, calls it an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. It certainly would. But there may be another reason for the Libyan attacks that explain their timing. According to Russian Today, Gaddafi was planning to introduce a gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth, and he was. And as we know, the recent history tells us that Gaddafi came to a sticky end. His golden oil plan was bombed away by coalition Libyan mission. So they also brought in a new doctrine to assist with the destruction of Libya, and that was the responsibility to protect. And this was supposedly a doctrine which gave nations the right to interfere in other nations if they thought that the people of that nation were under threat from their own government. So they came up with this doctrine, which is very new. Prior to this, it was generally understood by the international community that other nations were not allowed to interfere in their internal affairs. But this was a doctrine which was new, and this is a very fascist doctrine. Poor old Hitler, he would have loved to have used that doctrine when he was around. Notice what he's carrying in his hand there. US forces deployed to oil-rich Uganda. That's another nation which has just discovered oil, and suddenly America becomes interested in it. What do these three men have in common? Well, there you have Saddam, there you have Gaddafi, and there you have Ahmadinejad, who used to be the president of Iran. And they all were put down, if you like, except for Ahmadinejad, for selling oil other than for dollars. And Iran is the latest in the nations that are trying to wrestle their way away from the American empire and to establish their own destiny, if you like, by selling oil for anything other than US dollars. And that's why Iran is now in the crosshairs of the American empire. So when Iran tried to do the same as Saddam and same as Gaddafi, they imposed sanctions starting in 2006, and they needed a reason to impose sanctions. And they couldn't say, we're going to impose sanctions because you are now selling oil for anything but dollars. They had to come up with another reason, so they came up with the nuclear issue. So Iran is now sanctioned not only by America, but by they get their allies in Europe to do the same. UE agrees, European Union agrees new Iran sanctions, oil boycott in place by July 2012. And they put even more pressure on Iran. There's all sorts of black ops going against Tehran. Black ops are things like assassinations. I don't know whether you noticed, but in the news in recent years, there's lots of nuclear scientists getting killed in Iran, and mysterious explosions going off in some of their installations, and terrorists attacking the borderlands of Iran. These are all black ops, and they are done by intelligence communities. So Bush says, so I've told people that if you're interested in avoiding World War III, it seems like you ought to be interested in preventing them, he means the Iranians, from having the knowledge necessary to make a nuclear weapon. So this is the stick that America is going to beat Iran with. The issue being, we need to stop you from creating nuclear weapons. Well, the interesting thing is that Iran was nowhere near having the ability to create nuclear weapons, and it's very doubtful that they even had the inclination to do so. And all the intelligence agencies in America agreed. I'll show you that in a minute. Nevertheless, Iran presses ahead. They open up their own oil bourse, which is French for stock market, and they open up this bourse to sell oil for anything but American dollars. A fully functioning bourse will only be started after the bourse has demonstrated a reasonable period of trouble-free running. That's from the oil minister of Iran. And what he means by that is trouble-free running. He means, we'll wait and see what the empire does. So what they did was they opened this bourse to sell oil, but they actually only sold oil derivative products, you know, something that's made from oil. They didn't actually sell oil as a barrel of oil. So that's what they started. They started off very cautiously, waiting to see how the American empire would react. So here we have Newsweek saying the hidden war with Iran. Skirmishes, threats, missed signals, why the standoff could soon turn deadly. As of Thursday, March the 20th, 2008, the US is at war with Iran, according to Newsweek. And, you know, the UN Charter actually says that if one nation is going to impose sanctions upon another, that is actually a declaration of war. That's what the UN Charter says. And so it seems like America feels able and willing to impose sanctions willy-nilly wherever they want to, and nobody seems to object. But so this is a prior, if you like, declaration of war before military action. And the reason is because Iran is bucking the trend, going the same way as Saddam and Gaddafi. The dispute, this is from the Iranian newspaper, a Iranian newspaper. The dispute over Iran's nuclear program is nothing more than a convenient excuse for the US to use threats to protect the reserve currency status of the dollar. The newspaper, which calls itself the Voice of the Islamic Revolution, said, "Recall that Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would no longer accept dollars for oil purchases in November 2000, and the US Anglo invasion occurred in March 2003. The Times continued. Similarly, Iran opened its oil bush in 2008, so it is a credit to Iranian negotiating ability that the crisis has not come to a head long before now." One of the reasons why the crisis has not come to a head long before now is that Iran is a slightly different kettle of fish to Iraq and Iran. They're quite a powerful nation, and they're very, very dedicated. This is the Islamic Revolution country, and they're all dedicated to what they do, and they're armed to the teeth. So America has to tread cautiously. So that's why they go through Syria first. The road to Iran goes through Syria. And the reason why the Syrian conflict started is because Syria is an ally of Iran. So before you take on Iran, you destroy Syria, because Syria and Iran have a mutual defense agreement. They come to each other's assistance when they're in trouble. And so what America is doing is they're trying to isolate Iran. They're trying to push Russia and China away from Iran as well, create divisions between them so that nobody is willing to come to Iran's aid when push comes to shove and things really start exploding. So what we're witnessing at the moment, one of the signs of the times, is the terrible strife that's going on in Syria, and that is definitely related to what's going on between America and Iran. So the Syrian people are really suffering, but that doesn't stop Iran from keeping on with its dollar attack. So Iran now accepts gold for oil in 2012, and India was one of the countries that was willing to trade with Iran for gold. Iran presses ahead with dollar attack. Last week, the Tehran Times noted that the Iranian oil bush will start trading oil in currencies other than the dollar from March 20th. This long-planned move is part of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's vision of economic war with the West. So here you go. You know, most wars start first with economic issues, and this is exactly why. Remember how we started our first program with all the world's leaders saying that we're on the precipice of World War III? Well, this is why. This is interesting. Bush knew that the Iranians had ceased trying to make nuclear weapons, yet kept using the nuclear issue to threaten Iran. And that's a statement from the Dominion Post. Okay? Just think of the implications of this. Okay? The American administration knew that Iran did not have the ability or means to, or even the inclination to create nuclear weapons, but they kept using that as an excuse to attack Iran. So, why did they know? How did they know? Well, let's read what it says here. For months, Mr. Bush has called Iran a threat, and in October raised the spectre of World War III if it acquired a nuclear weapon. A new intelligence estimate This is an American intelligence estimate. This week said Iran had stopped its nuclear weapons program in 2003, raising questions about whether Mr. Bush was aware of that when he stepped up his rhetoric against Tehran. Here you have all the intelligence agencies that exist in America. There are 16 of them altogether. Now, these intelligence agencies have been copying the blame for all the intelligence failures that supposedly took place to allow America to mistakenly attack Iraq. So they are now very upset. They've copped the blame for deliberate deception, and they're not happy. So they actually now rebel against the American administration. Look, now they tell us, see, he's got his pockets open, no nuclear weapons. Look what it says on this Time magazine. A new intelligence report says Iran has halted its nuclear weapons program. What that revelation tells us about our spy network, the White House and the battle between them. And this is what is in the story, in the Time magazine. The moment seemed certainly historic. This was quite possibly the most assertive and rebellious act in the history of the US intelligence community. You see, you've got to understand that not everybody supports the American empire. There are people in America themselves who see what is happening, who see what's happening to their own country, and they're actually fighting against it. And this is one of the acts that took place. The whole intelligence community basically yanked the chain out from underneath the Bush administration, and the Americans had to back off from their plans to attack Iran. So that's why we see in the New Zealand Herald World War III on hold for the moment, because the justification for World War III, for attacking Iran, was just taken away from the American administration. So we came close back then, but we're certainly not finished with the problems that exist out there and the agendas that are going on, where the nations are pressing against one another, and the one that is applying the most pressure is the American empire. So we're going to look next time at the prophetic connection. We've finished at the moment for what's going on in the world around us. We're going to delve into that a little bit more, but we need to now talk about Bible prophecy and how these things that we are seeing around us in the world have been portrayed in Scripture. And I think you'll find that very, very fascinating. But before we go, I still want to remind you, and I'm going to remind you every time, that God is in control. These things can be a little frightening. The concept of World War III can be a little frightening for a lot of people, but I just want to remind you, God is in control. Look what he says here. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. So place your commitment with Christ, get onto God's side, join the kingdom, and God will assist you when these things come upon us.